The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Clara Martinez pressed her face against the cold bathroom mirror, trying to convince herself she could go through with it. Her hands trembled as she splashed water on her face, the decision weighing heavier than the fake ID in her back pocket. In 3 hours, she would be lying on an operating table in a basement clinic across town, selling a piece of herself to save the only person who had ever loved her. Her mother's voice echoed from the hospital bed down the hall, weak, but still trying to sing the lullaby that had carried Clara through countless nightmares. The same lullaby that would soon be silenced forever if Clara didn't find $30,000 by the end of the week. The kidney failure was advancing faster than anyone had predicted, and the insurance company had denied their final appeal that morning. Clara stared at her reflection, seeing her mother's eyes looking back at her. 22 years old, working 3 jobs, and it still wasn't enough. Nothing was ever enough. The underground broker had promised her $25,000 for a healthy kidney, enough to cover most of the surgery, enough to buy her mother more time. The risks were real, but so was the certainty of watching the woman who raised her alone slowly die while doctors talked about waiting lists and experimental treatments they couldn't afford. She touched her side where the scar would be, imagining the emptiness that would remain. Some prices couldn't be measured in money, but love demanded payment in whatever currency the heart could offer. Clara dried her hands, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward a choice that would change everything in ways she could never have imagined. Clara had learned early that the world didn't owe her anything. Growing up in the cramped apartment above Rodriguez's grocery store, she had watched her mother, Elena, work 16-hour days just to keep them afloat. Elena never spoke about Clara's father, only that he had left when Clara was 6 months old, disappearing like smoke on a windy day. "Some people aren't built for staying," Eleanor would say, whenever Clara asked, her voice carrying no bitterness, only the quiet acceptance of someone who had learned to expect nothing and be grateful for everything. Now Elena lay in St. Mary's Hospital, her kidneys failing after years of untreated diabetes and high blood pressure, conditions she had ignored because doctor visits cost money they didn't have. The irony wasn't lost on Clara, that the woman who had given her everything might die because she couldn't afford to give herself basic health care. Dr. Peterson had been kind but direct. Without a transplant, Elena had maybe 2 months. With it, she could live another 20 years. The surgery would cost $30,000 up front, and their insurance had found every possible reason to deny coverage. Clara had applied for loans, started fundraising campaigns, even considered selling her mother's wedding ring, the only thing of value they owned. That's when she found the card, tucked behind a loose brick in the alley beside her apartment building. Just a phone number and the words, "We pay top dollar for healthy organs. Discretion guaranteed." The choice felt inevitable, like gravity pulling her toward a decision that terrified and liberated her at the same time. She would save her mother, no matter the cost to herself. Before we continue with Clara's journey, I want you to be part of this story. Please subscribe to The Storyteller, hit that like button if you're feeling this story so far, and let me know in the comments which country and city you're watching from. Your support means everything, and I read every single comment. The clinic looked nothing like the sterile hospital where her mother lay dying. Hidden behind a laundromat in the industrial district, it was accessed through a back door that required 3 different knocks and a password Clara had memorized like a prayer. The waiting room was a converted storage space with mismatched chairs and fluorescent lights that flickered like dying stars. Clara wasn't alone. A middle-aged man sat in the corner, nervously checking his phone every few seconds. A young woman about Clara's age stared at the floor, her leg bouncing with anxiety. None of them made eye contact. There was an unspoken understanding that what brought them here was desperation, too private for small talk. Clara Martinez. The voice belonged to a woman in scrubs who looked like she might have been a real nurse once, before whatever circumstances brought her to this place. Clara followed her down a narrow hallway lined with motivational posters that felt grotesque in this context. Believe in yourself and every ending is a new beginning seemed to mock the gravity of what was about to happen. The examination room was surprisingly clean, though the equipment looked older than Clara. Dr. Hoffman, the surgeon, was professional but distant as he explained the procedure. He would remove her left kidney through a small incision. The recovery would take 6 to 8 weeks, and she would need to avoid heavy lifting for the rest of her life. The risks were minimal, he assured her, though his eyes suggested he had delivered this speech many times before. The buyer has requested anonymity, Dr. Hoffman continued, reviewing her charts. Standard procedure. Payment will be transferred to your account within 24 hours of successful completion. Clara nodded, signing forms that she barely read. Her mind was back at the hospital, imagining her mother's face when she learned that the surgery was suddenly possible. Eleanor would ask questions, of course. Where did the money come from? How had their luck changed so dramatically? Clara would lie, and Elena would probably know she was lying, but sometimes love meant accepting the gift without examining its wrapping too closely. The anesthesia was surprisingly gentle, pulling Clara into darkness with the efficiency of a sunset. Her last conscious thought was of her mother's lullaby, the melody that had been her compass through every storm life had thrown at them. She woke up in a recovery room that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. The pain in her side was sharp but manageable, and Dr. Hoffman assured her that everything had gone perfectly. The kidney was healthy, the recipient was stable, and her bank account would reflect the agreed-upon amount by tomorrow morning. There is one unusual request, the doctor said, consulting his clipboard. The recipient would like to meet you. It's highly irregular and you're under no obligation to agree, but he's asked specifically for a brief meeting if you're willing. Clara's first instinct was to refuse. The anonymity had been part of the appeal. She could go home, recover quietly, and let her mother believe in whatever miracle story she chose to tell. But something in the doctor's tone suggested this wasn't an ordinary request. "Why does he want to meet me?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "He didn't say," Dr. Hoffman replied, "just that it was important to him. The meeting would take place here, supervised, and would last no more than 15 minutes. Clara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision. She had already crossed so many lines to get to this point. What was one more? Maybe there was something poetic about meeting the person who would carry a piece of her for the rest of his life. Maybe it would help her process what she had done, to see that her sacrifice had a face and a story. "All right," she said finally. "I'll meet him." The doctor nodded and made a note on his chart. "Tomorrow morning, once you've both had time to recover, I'll arrange it." Clara spent the rest of the day staring at the ceiling, wondering what kind of man could afford to buy a kidney on the black market, and whether he would understand the price she had paid to save someone she loved. The next morning arrived with the kind of grey light that made everything look like a photograph fading at the edges. Clara had barely slept, the pain medication making her feel like she was floating just above her own body. Every movement reminded her of what she had given up, the hollow ache in her side, a constant whisper of the choice she had made. Dr. Hoffman appeared at her door precisely at 9 o'clock, his expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses that had seen too much. "The recipient is ready to meet you, if you still want to go through with this." Clara nodded, though her stomach churned with something that wasn't entirely related to the surgery. She had spent the night imagining what this person would be like. Wealthy, probably older, maybe someone who had waited years on a transplant list before deciding to circumvent the system. She pictured expensive clothes, the kind of confidence that money brings, perhaps even gratitude that might make this whole ordeal feel worthwhile. The wheelchair felt unnecessary, but Dr. Hoffman insisted as he pushed her down the same flickering hallway toward a room she hadn't seen before. The building seemed different in daylight, shabbier, more desperate. like makeup under harsh fluorescent lights. Clara wondered how many other people had made this same journey, how many pieces of themselves had been bought and sold in these sterile rooms. "He's been asking about you since yesterday," Dr. Hoffman said as they paused outside a door marked with the number 7. "Seems quite anxious to meet you, though I can't say why. These situations are usually more straightforward." Clara's heart began to race, though she couldn't pinpoint the source of her sudden anxiety. "What do you mean, these situations?" "Most recipients prefer complete anonymity. They get their organ, they recover, they go back to their lives. The psychological aspect of carrying someone else's body part can be complicated. But this man..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "He's been very insistent." The doctor knocked twice and opened the door without waiting for a response. The room was identical to Clara's. Narrow bed, single window, the same motivational posters that felt increasingly surreal. But it was the man in the bed that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. He was probably in his 50s, with graying hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into bright sunlight. His hands, resting on top of the hospital blanket, were weathered in a way that suggested manual labor, though his clothes looked expensive enough to contradict that impression. There was something familiar about the shape of his face, the way he held his shoulders, but Clara couldn't place where she might have seen him before. When their eyes met, the man went completely still, his face drained of color, and his mouth opened slightly as if he were about to speak, but had forgotten how to form words. Clara felt a similar shock of recognition, though it made no logical sense. She was certain she had never seen this man before in her life. "My God," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning. "You look exactly like your mother." The words hit Clara like cold water. Her mother? How could this stranger know anything about Elena? Dr. Hoffman looked between them with growing confusion, clearly sensing that this meeting was veering into territory he hadn't anticipated. "I'm sorry," Clara said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. "I think there's been some mistake. You don't know my mother." The man sat up straighter in his bed, wincing slightly from his own surgical pain. His eyes never left Clara's face, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of 22 years of regret. "Elena Rodriguez," he said quietly. "Dark hair, scar on her left hand from when she cut herself making tamales, sings lullabies in Spanish when she thinks no one is listening." Clara's world tilted sideways. Those details weren't public knowledge. They were the intimate fragments of a life shared only between a mother and daughter. Her hands gripped the armrests of her wheelchair as the impossible truth began to take shape in her mind. "Who are you?" she whispered, though somewhere deep in her heart she already knew the answer. The silence stretched between them, like a bridge neither of them knew how to cross. Clara stared at the man who had just described her mother with the accuracy of someone who had once loved her, and felt the ground shifting beneath everything she thought she knew about her life. "My name is Miguel Santos," he said finally, each word deliberate and heavy, "and I've been looking for you and your mother for 22 years. Dr. Hoffman cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps I should give you two some privacy." "No," Clara said sharply, her voice cutting through the tension. "Don't leave." She needed a witness to this moment, someone to confirm that she wasn't hallucinating from the medication. "You're my father." It wasn't a question. The resemblance was undeniable now that she was looking for it. The same stubborn chin, the same way of tilting his head when thinking, the same hands that Clara saw every time she looked in the mirror. Miguel nodded slowly, tears gathering in the corners of his eyes. Clara felt something cold and sharp unfurling in her chest. 22 years of wondering, of making up stories about a father who might have been a hero or a villain, and the truth was simpler and more devastating than either. He had been a coward. "You just left," she said, the words coming out flat and emotionless. You walked away from a 6-month-old baby and never looked back. I looked back every day, Miguel said urgently, leaning forward in his bed. Clara, there hasn't been a single day in 22 years that I haven't thought about you and your mother. I tried to find you dozens of times, but Elena had moved, changed her name back to Rodriguez. It was like you had vanished. Good, Clara said, surprised by the venom in her own voice. She was protecting us from someone who couldn't be trusted to stay. Dr. Hoffman had quietly slipped from the room, leaving Clara and Miguel alone with 22 years of unspoken words hanging between them like ghosts. Clara gripped the armrests of her wheelchair, feeling the surgical pain in her side pulse in rhythm with the ache in her chest. The man before her was both a stranger and the missing piece of her origin story, and she didn't know whether to scream or cry. "Tell me about the money," she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "Tell me how you got rich while we ate cereal for dinner 3 nights a week." Miguel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture so familiar it made Clara's stomach lurch. She had seen her own reflection make that same movement countless times. "After I left, I went to Texas, got work on oil rigs, saved every penny. When the shale boom started, I invested everything I had in a small drilling company. Got lucky, really lucky. The company went public 5 years ago." "How lucky?" Clara asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "Lucky enough that I could have paid for your mother's surgery 100 times over without thinking about it." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Clara closed her eyes, imagining an alternate timeline where her mother had never gotten sick from the stress of poverty, where Clara had gone to college instead of working 3 jobs, where the word impossible hadn't been the answer to so many of her childhood dreams. "Why didn't you try harder to find us?" she asked, opening her eyes to study his face. 22 years, Miguel. You could have hired better investigators, put ads in newspapers, done something more than just hire some private detective 6 months ago. Miguel's face crumpled with shame. "Because I was a coward," he said simply, "the same coward who ran away when you were 6 months old. Every year that passed made it harder to imagine facing Elena, facing you. What could I say? Sorry I abandoned you, but I'm rich now, so everything's fine." "You could have said you were sorry," Clara replied quietly. "You could have said you made a mistake. You could have given my mother the choice instead of making it for her." "I know." His voice was barely a whisper. "I know. And I hate myself for it every single day." 3 days later, Clara sat beside her mother's hospital bed, watching Elena sleep peacefully for the first time in months. The transplant surgery had been a complete success. The kidney that had once been Clara's was now filtering toxins from her mother's blood, giving her the gift of years they had thought were lost forever. Elena stirred, her eyes fluttering open with the soft confusion of someone emerging from deep anesthesia. When she saw Clara, her face brightened with a smile that made Clara's heart ache with love and guilt in equal measure. "Mija," Elena whispered, her voice scratchy but stronger than it had been in weeks. "The doctors say the surgery went perfectly. They say I'm going to be fine." She paused, studying Clara's face with the intuitive sharpness of a mother who had raised her daughter alone. "But they won't tell me where the money came from." Clara had rehearsed this conversation dozens of times, crafting lies that would protect her mother from the truth about both the kidney and Miguel's return. But looking into Elena's eyes that had never judged her, never given up on her, never asked for anything but love in return, Clara found that she couldn't lie anymore. "I sold my kidney, Mama," she said quietly, "to a man who needed it to live." Elena's face went through a series of emotions: shock, horror, anger, and finally a deep sadness that seemed to age her years in seconds. "Clara, no. Please tell me you didn't." "It's done," Clara said gently, taking her mother's hand. And I would do it again 1,000 times to save you. But Mama, there's more you need to know. Over the next hour, Clara told her mother everything. About the underground clinic, about the meeting with the recipient, about the impossible coincidence that had brought them face to face with the man who had walked out of their lives 22 years ago. Elena listened in silence, her grip on Clara's hand tightening with each new revelation. When Clara finished, Elena closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them again, they were filled with tears, but also with something that looked like understanding. "He saved my life," Elena said quietly. "The man who broke my heart saved my life with the kidney my daughter sold to save me." She shook her head slightly. "Life has a strange sense of poetry, doesn't it?" "Are you angry?" Clara asked. "At me for not telling you? At him for coming back? At the whole impossible situation?" 6 months later, Clara stood in the doorway of her mother's kitchen, watching Elena teach Miguel how to make tamales. The same recipe that had once cut her hand and left the scar he had remembered after all these years. His movements were clumsy, uncertain, like a man learning to speak a language he had forgotten he once knew. The reconciliation hadn't been easy or quick. There had been arguments, tears, and long silences filled with 22 years of accumulated hurt. Miguel had moved slowly, carefully, proving his commitment through small gestures and patient presence rather than grand declarations. He paid for Clara's education, helped Elena open the small restaurant she had always dreamed of, and showed up every Sunday for dinner, whether the conversation flowed easily or stumbled over old wounds. Clara touched her side, where the scar had healed into a thin white line, a permanent reminder of the price of love and the strange mathematics of sacrifice. Sometimes the heart required payment in blood before it could accept the gift of redemption. Sometimes you had to lose a piece of yourself to save the people who mattered most. And sometimes, in the mystery of second chances, what was taken could become the bridge that brought everyone home.